Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Greason. This is going to be lesson number 2, module for the week of September 7th through September the 11th. Today, we're going to start talking about choral music. We are in chorus class, and choral music actually has a very long and rich history. So we're going to kind of start from the beginning. And that's going to take us way back to the medieval era and the Renaissance era of music. And then specifically, we're going to talk about the composer Guillaume Dufay, who's one of the first very well-known composers of choral music. Before we get started talking about Guillaume Dufay, I thought I would talk a little bit about the medieval era of music. The medieval era of music starts from about the year 450 to the year 1450. That is about 1,000 years of time. That's a lot that we don't usually see that long of a time period in history, let alone music history. This is also the time frame known as the Middle Ages. If you've had world history, you may have heard talk about that. It's also called the Dark Ages of history in Europe. This is the same time frame that we had the bubonic plague or the Black Death that spread all throughout Europe and killed probably about 1/3 of Europe's population at that time. But when we talk about music in the medieval era, we will talk a lot about the Roman Catholic Church. At this time, the Roman Catholic Church held a lot of power in the world, especially in Europe, and really had more power even than royalty, kings and queens. And so that's really where music and musical notation first began, was through the Roman Catholic Church. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about today. Although some instrumental music was performed during the era, most medieval music was vocal. Part of that was because within the Roman Catholic Church, instruments were seen as evil, actually. They did not feel like that was something that belonged in the church, and so you did not have any instruments in church music in the beginning. The two types of vocal music that you see are sacred music, which is music performed in churches, and secular music, which was music performed outside the church. Secular music was the popular or pop music of its time. It was usually performed by traveling musicians or troubadours who traveled around from town to town and were singing and playing for anyone who would listen. Often they would also be court players for a royal court. So they would go and entertain at parties and events for kings and queens and such. Some of the instruments that you did see in secular music at that time were some stringed instruments, small harps, a lute, which was this pear-shaped stringed instrument that was actually the precursor to the guitar. You also had percussion instruments, drums, cymbals, and bells, as well as some wind instruments like a flute, which would have been actually made out of wood at the time, and bagpipes. All of these would have been small and easy to carry if you were traveling. Sacred music basically equals church music. And again, as I said, primarily for the Roman Catholic Church. For centuries, the church was the primary place where serious musicians could perform music together. At first, church music was just what we call a single melody sung by one person or a group. Singers were almost always men, except in convents. One female musician and composer of the time, Hildegard von Bingen, was a nun who was in charge of a convent in Germany. She actually was one of the first women composers who gained some notoriety, and people knew who she was. And she composed quite a bit of music, But it's also important to note that most of her music was only sung by women in the convents. Um, the single melody that I referred to is really what we refer to as a chant. And when we have a chant, again, it's a single melody that they're singing. It could be one person or a group, but the group would all be singing the same notes and the same rhythms at the same time, which is what we might call unison today. And this really came about from, again, the Roman Catholic Church. They had lots of different prayers that they would have to say throughout the day. There were morning prayers, there were mid-morning prayers, there were afternoon prayers. And instead of speaking those many prayers throughout the day, a priest would sing it on various pitches that we called chants. The priest would make up the chants and teach them to the other priests and male singers. After a while, though, it became difficult to remember all the different chants, and they developed a group of written symbols called neumes. And this was the beginning of what we know as musical notation. Keep in mind, though, that these neumes did not look anything like what you might see on a piece of music today. We did not have the 5-line staff with a treble clef and a bass clef and the notes and rhythms like you see them today. It was very different, and that notation actually developed over several hundred years of the priests working on that and changing it to become what we know today. In the lesson link, I have included a video of a chant that you can listen to if you would like to go to that and listen to that. Around 900 to 1200, the singers began to add a second part to the single line chants. Music that had more than one voice part is called polyphony. Polyphony, again, was if you had 2 or 3 or 4 and even 6 voice parts as we get into later music. But in the beginning, they would have added one more line, and that second melody was usually below the original melody by an interval of a fourth or fifth. They moved together rhythmically and melodically in parallel movement. And this is what we call organum. Also in the lesson link, I have a video of organum as an example for you to listen to as well. Polyphony continued to grow through the last 300 years of the medieval era, from 1150 to 1450. And then by 1400, the first great cathedrals were being built in Europe, giving composers wonderful places for their music to be performed. Keep in mind that virtually all the serious music written in the medieval era was sacred vocal music. Again, the Roman Catholic Church held quite a bit of power, and so that's why we have so much real church music. Our first music that we have any written record of is sacred vocal music, because the priests and the monks in the monasteries and in the cathedrals were the only ones who knew how to read and write. And so they are the ones who actually came up with this musical notation system that evolved that we know today. Moving on to Guillaume Dufay. Guillaume Dufay is considered to be one of the most important composers of the 15th century. He was born in Brussels, Belgium, most likely in 1397. Historians aren't sure on the exact day of his birth, but they sort of narrowed it down to around 1397. He moved at a somewhat young age with his mother to Cambrai, France, where he became a choir boy at the cathedral in 1409. He received his musical education there at the cathedral, and Guillaume actually spent his entire life in service to the Catholic Church. In 1420, he then traveled to Italy, where he met other composers and began composing vocal works for church choirs. It's important to note here that Italy is now becoming a very big center for music at that time. And so a lot of composers actually traveled to Italy at that time to learn more about music and musical techniques of the time. He then spent much of the 1430s living and working in various Italian cities, always serving the church and composing choral music. Uh, at some point, there was some political unrest, and he took a little trip back to France and actually studied law for a while and became a lawyer as well. He was traveling again through in Italy, but then eventually returned again to France in 1445 and became the choir master for the Duke of Savoy. He also taught music and gave lessons in composition. Dufay traveled extensively throughout Europe and was often commissioned to write music for the choirs of various dukes and kings. When you commission someone to write a piece of music, that is when you ask them to write a piece for either someone or a very specific occasion, and usually pay them a good bit of money to do that. He was actually in great demand as a choir master and composer, and he died in Cambrai, France in 1474. Dufay's music was the most important of what is known as the Netherlands School of Music Composition, or the Burgundian School. And although he wrote mostly sacred masses and motets, he did also compose some secular music, such as chanson. Chanson is actually just the French word for song. Now we're going to look at and talk about a piece of his music, and we're actually going to listen to a selection of music by Guillaume Dufay. We're going to listen to Kyrie from his Mass, the Missa L'Homme Armé. L'Homme Armé was a secular French song from the Renaissance era. This tune or melody was set by many different composers. Sorry, that's a little typo in there. More than 40 settings of this melody were used in Latin masses that survived from this period. Latin was the official language of the Roman Catholic Church at that time, and so all sacred music of the time was written in Latin. The tempo and meter of the Kyrie was written in 3/4 time, and it had a minor tune. The original lyric partially translates as "the armed man should be feared." Versions of the actual melody exist as early as the 1450s. A cyclic mass became quite the rage in the early Renaissance era. Each section of the mass was based on this one main melody, which was called the cantus firmus. So the mass was musically unified. It used one main melody that it would keep coming back around to, meaning cyclic, to help sort of unify all the different sections of the Mass. Usually there were at least a minimum of 5 sections of the Roman Catholic Mass, and sometimes there were many more. The Kyrie is most often set in ABA form because of its text. You had an A section which had the text Kyrie eleison, which translates to Lord have mercy. The B section had the text Christe eleison, which translates to Christ have mercy. And then you would have a repeat of the A section, again with the text Kyrie eleison, which again is Lord have mercy. The Mass was written around 1460, and Dufay uses the first line of L'Homme Armé for the opening Kyrie. He uses the second line for the Christe section. Then the original Kyrie melody returns. The 4 a cappella or no accompaniment voices sing, weaving polyphonic lines with long melismas. A melisma is many notes sung on the same word or syllable, making it sometimes difficult to hear that main theme. So let's listen. Follow along with the timing. I'm going to pull it up here for you. All right. Here we go. All right, that was the Kyrie, which would have been the very first section in the Mass, Misa Loma Arme. All right, let's go back here. I hope you enjoyed that. I know that's not something you probably are used to listening to, but that is really one of the very earliest examples of choral music that we have. So your assignment for the week, other than the Flipgrid assignment that you should have already looked at and hopefully done, is in Google Classroom. You're going to go to number 5 in the module, week of September 7th through September the 11th. Read the PDF attachment about Guillaume Dufay, and then you're going to click on the Google form, which I believe is actually in number 6, to answer some questions about what you've read in the PDF attachment. Make sure to submit the form and make sure you click Turn In Google Classroom to submit all of your assignments, okay? I hope you guys have a great week. Bye.